Carl Davis is the training director. He'll be here in just a few minutes, and the battery's not out there. I'll back up, fortunately. And he handles all the training things. Either one of us can help you with if you need some things about the class or whatever. We'll be glad to help you. That's his email address there. He'll speak to you a little bit when he gets here. Again, as we said, this is my email address, and I try to write it up here every week. If you email me, I get a lot of email, and I want to give yours a priority. I get a lot of email that doesn't get priority. So if you just write tech, T-E-C-H in capital letters in the subject line, just tech, and then whatever the subjects you want to put on there, that'll tip me off that it's somebody from the tech class, and like I say, I'll give that a priority. And also, if I miss, I've got a bunch, I can just search for tech, and then I'll see all the messages I may have with that in it. So if you do that, I'll answer it either anyway, or try to answer it, but it might get lost in the shuffle if you don't do that. So that's why we ask for that. This is the manual. I think all of you have it. If you don't, you really need to get a copy, because this manual is as important as the class, or more important than the class, because that's where the sample questions are, the detailed explanations, etc. So if you don't have one, then we certainly say that you really need one to pass the course. So the license manual, again, available from the American Radio Relay League or from Amazon, any number of places. So my background is, actually, we will be going into October, and October is my anniversary month. I got licensed in 1968. That means come next year, I'll be celebrating my 50th anniversary as a ham operator. So I've been around for a long time. I got licensed when I was 2 years old. But, okay, I wasn't quite that young, but I was pretty young. So I'm not that old now. It's like experience in my job. I have a lot of experience in the work that I do. But I only say I've got over 30 years experience, because I really don't want to have more experience than that. I don't want to be old enough to have more experience than that. So anyway, so I'm almost hesitant to say I've soon been a ham 50 years, but I have been a ham for many, many years, and I've done a little bit of everything that you can do as a ham, and so I have a pretty broad range of experiences. My real interest are field day and emergency operation, because that is the crux of why we have the frequencies we have. We have to provide something back. The government allows us a broader range of frequencies than probably any other group in the United States. And one of the things we do, the two things we get into, is emergency communications, and then trying to come up with new technologies and new ideas. Now, a lot of the cutting edge stuff now has kind of moved beyond us a little bit, but one thing that we have done even in the recent past is take existing technologies and come up with ways to make them cheaper. So that's another way. But anyway, field day emergency operations, where I work. Field day is a day or weekend that's held every year, last full weekend in June, where we go out into a field, out into an area that's unpopulated, has no antennas, no radios, anything. We set up tents, and now recently one big tent. We get radios, put tables up, start from zero, put antennas up from scratch into trees. We have not self-supporting, but guide masts that we put up that are actually ex-military masts. We put antennas on the top of those, and for a 24-hour period, we try to contact as many people as we can over the whole United States. And so it's a contest, and the joke is it's a contest and it's not a contest. It's a contest, but the real key is to check our ability. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention everything's run on generators. So we're all our power and everything. We used to do it now. This last year we did it at the Raleigh Police Club. because we try to do it someplace where people can come and see it, because it's also a publicity thing to show people what we can do. And we used to do it out on a farm, out in the depths of the farm. And it always was interesting, and before that we did it at Umstead State Park. And you take an area of woods and trees and there's nothing there on Friday, and then by Saturday at 2 p.m. we've got tents and radios and all the infrastructure to make contacts across the United States and really around the world. And then going to 2 o'clock Sunday, and then by 6 or 7 o'clock on Sunday it's back to woods again. So I've always found that transformation kind of fascinating myself, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. So we certainly encourage you to participate in Field Day. I usually am what's called a band captain. I have one of the stations that I'm responsible for, and that's a lot of fun, etc. I've done instructing for a good little bit. I was away from it. I didn't do it for a while. I did it back in the 90s, and then didn't do it for a while, and started about 3-4 years ago again. And as you've seen a little bio thing, I used to do some teaching at community colleges, computer courses, and my field background, I'm an energy engineer, a mechanical engineer that works in energy conservation, and I've taught those kind of courses in community colleges and for NC State Extension and UNC Charlotte and A&T and Virginia Tech, places like that. I also like to write. I've written for several magazines, and actually most recently wrote for QST, the official magazine of the ARLL. Actually, I did a review on a scanner. I like scanners and shortwave listening as well as ham radio. My father got his license about 15 years after I did. I got mine, actually, to be honest, at 13 years old. So he got his a little later, and he used some of my equipment after he got his license, and I told him, I said, that's not the way it's supposed to be, Dad. I'm supposed to use you're supposed to have the equipment, and I'm supposed to be able to use your equipment as the son, so we kind of worked it a little backwards. Then my brother-in-law, they've been married for a long time, but he recently became a ham, so it was something I could do with my father and brother-in-law, and made a lot of friends and contacts across the country. I spent a few years in Houston, Texas, and when I got to Houston, it was like I had a family there already. I joined the ham clubs, and I was welcomed as cordially as I could be welcomed anywhere. In fact, I went to Houston when I was interviewing for the job, and I was looking at potential houses, and a ham from one of the local clubs that had just met me actually drove with me to look at houses and whatnot, because he knew the area and I didn't. So I've been to Japan and met hams in Japan, been to Germany and met hams in Germany. Again, it really is like a fraternity. It's once most people are very nice. One thing about hams, and I'll use a phrase that a ham magazine editor used to use, he used to say, whatever part of our brain that is miswired for ham radio also is miswired for computers. But anyway, it's also, because hams were very early in the use of computers, but it's also in that we have a common interest, and it just gives you I can say I've been places and it's like you've been friends for a long time. So it really is contacts across the country and friends across the country. And if we have time, I might tell you about one time, since you know about the Houston flooding. I was in Houston in '75 when it flooded, not as bad as it is now. I was actually doing a summer job then in Houston, and ham radio bailed me out of a bad situation. So might get into that at some point. Also, as I said, I'm a mechanical engineer, but I work in energy conservation, and the way I got into energy was because I had both a mechanical and electronics background. They were, at the time I got into energy in 1978, and nobody had much experience in it. And they were looking for interdisciplinary people that knew mechanics and mechanical systems, and new electronics and some computers. I may get into that. Ham radio actually helped me get into computers way before most other people did. And so it's really helped me in my career. I also find it's not unusual. I go somewhere, I usually, a lot of times, this is, w4cp.com is a domain that I created, and I put that on my business cards. And just the other day, I was talking to somebody at work, on a totally work subject. He says, "You're a ham operator?" I said, "Yes, I am too." And so you bump into those. If you're an engineer, it helps, because again, you find out a lot of other engineers are ham. It's not unusual. And you don't have to be an engineer to be a ham. Don't let me make you think that. But if you're in the technical fields, it's very helpful, and it's also helpful in deciding to get into a technical field. So ham radio has been a great thing for me. I really, like I said, I've been with it since I was 13 years old. By the time I was 26 or 27, I thought about, I've been a ham over half my life. Well, now I've been a ham, much more than that. When I buy a car, the first thing I think about is where I'm going to put an antenna. If I move to a new place, the first thing I think is where am I going to put my antenna. So it's really ingrained into me. The national organization is the American Radio Relay League, founded in 1914, and really the American Radio Relay League is the reason we have ham radio. It is the organization that represents us. And I'll go ahead and tell you, I'm a life member, and I've been a life member for a long time. The life membership has paid off for me. I would have paid much more in yearly fees because I joined as a life member pretty young than I would have ever paid for the life membership. But also I want to support the National Association that when Congress is making rules, and actually there's a thing before Congress right now that we're involved with, we have some representation in Washington to look after our interest. And again, some people will give you faults with ARLL, and it's not a perfect organization. I would never say that it is. I don't know a perfect organization. I'm a member of a pretty good church, but it's not a perfect organization either. You'd hope that they would be closer than anybody else. So there is no perfect organization, but it does a good job. It occasionally takes positions that I would disagree with or whatever, but it provides the book that we have here. It does news, support, representation. It sponsors Field Day. And there are many other operating events. We get support for classes and whatnot from ARLL. So it's a great organization. We certainly would encourage you as you begin your ham radio career that you consider joining that. Again, it's not a requirement. There's about 160,000 members. There's about 700,000 hams. So obviously not even half of all hams do it. But many of the active hams, there's a good number of hams that are kind of inactive, are members, and we certainly encourage you to, because it really is a good organization in many ways. And again, I don't know anybody or any organization I agree with all the time, but it's a great organization. RARS is the Raleigh Amateur Radio Society. Was founded in 1969. It's the largest club in North Carolina. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It gets involved with public service, technical support, Field Day, which we mentioned, the RARS Fest. This is a picture from RARS Fest. Ham Fest, or what hams have, they're like little conventions. Typically they have a big flea market. Many times the flea market is outside. In fact, they call it tailgating. People will pull up their trucks and drop the tailgate. We've got one. Oh no, we just had Shelby. So the biggest one around in this area is in Shelby, North Carolina, just west of Charlotte, and it is outdoors. It's in a county fairgrounds. The RARS Ham Fest is actually on the NC State Fair area, and it's in a building, so all of it is actually indoors. It's in April. So, but RARS supports that, and actually that makes money for RARS and helps support RARS activities. And Hamfest is where a lot of people buy equipment. They get to see equipment they haven't had a chance to see, etc. So it's a great thing that it does with that. So RARS is very involved in virtually every aspect of radio, and we certainly appreciate your, they sponsor this particular class, and they would appreciate your support. And actually, when you get licensed, you will get a 1-year membership to RARS for free. So you'll get a chance, you'll be a member of RARS if you want to be for free for the first year after you get licensed. So we appreciate that. There are other clubs, and they're good clubs too. Cary has a club, Tar Heel Scanner Shortwave Listening Group, I put that up at the top because I started that. That actually started as a subgroup, special interest group of ours. They were nice enough to let me kind of use their, but that's for shortwave listening and scanners, and again, something I'm very interested in. Falls Lake Amateur Radio JARS, Johnson Amateur Radio Society, I've been a member of that, and actually was an officer of that for some years because I'm from Johnston County. Orange County, of course, the Chapel Hill area. And when I was at NC State, I was a member and an officer in the Student Amateur Radio Society there. South Wake Amateur Radio Club is a new club, relatively new, but it's become very active and doing a lot of interesting things. If you live in this Fuquay, South Wake area, or even if you don't, but it's kind of headquartered there. Triangle East Amateur Radio Association, more east of Raleigh area. Cape Fear Amateur Radio Society, that's Fayetteville. That's another good club, and in fact, I need to get a little more involved with that. I actually work at Fort Bragg every day, so I have a long commute every day. But there's a comprehensive list here at the club. So we encourage you, when I said some people are inactive, one of the reasons some people get inactive is they don't stay plugged into people. The best that you can have is to have a support group of other people. If you've got a question after this class, again, you can still email me. I have occasionally get email from students from other classes, previous classes. But having people you can ask is the best thing in the world to have. We call supporters in ham radio Elmers for some reason that started. So your mentor or helper in ham radio is called an Elmer. But having an Elmer, or even having several people that you can go to get opinions on equipment, etc., is extremely important. It really helps you out. It's good for them. It's really good for everybody. So wherever you want to go to involve with a club, we certainly encourage you to get involved with a club, get involved with other ham radio operators, and if you have questions and want to do things, it's always more fun to be able to do them with other people, and clubs help support that. The syllabus for what we're going to be doing, you should read and study the material prior to each class. I'm a pretty decent teacher, but I can't learn it for you. And there's more than we can cover in line by line here in the class. What I'm trying to do in the class is give you an overview of the subject and also answer questions. So, but you really do need to read and study material, and some of the material I'm going to mention in just a minute is almost all going to be on you. We try to teach this course not to the test. We just don't take the questions and then give you an answer. We teach it in an overview of how this blends in with everything else so that you become well-rounded ham operators as you get your license and proceed. But it is focused on those topics and areas that are covered by the technician class exam, of course. So I'm here to review the information and to answer questions, etc. But it really depends on you to cover the material in the book, and the book's an excellent source. I tell you what, you've got a secret weapon. We all got a secret weapon nowadays. If there's something you don't understand, and maybe you can't get with me or whatever, Google, secret weapon if you need to know about something. Now remember, on the internet, like I said, I used to teach computer courses, you can get bad information. There's people that will give you replies to your questions that don't know what they're talking about. Sad to say, that's true. But if you read through several of them, you can kind of weed out the BS from the truth. So again, ask questions. You'll need a calculator. Of course, most of us have a scientific calculator along with everything else that this thing will do. So, but you do get a chance to use a calculator for some of those type things. Today, we're doing introductions, the syllabus. The video we'll do in just a minute. Chapter 1, we won't be, this is the covering of Chapter 1. You read it on your own. There's no content on the exam. It's just a welcome to ham radio. We'll try to do all of Chapter 2 today and get them started on Chapter 3. Then, in next week, 23rd, Chapter 3, finish it, and try to do Chapter 4 in total. September 30th, we didn't have a class here because of some scheduling problems, and so there's going to be a demonstration, and Carl will get up and talk to you about the demonstration in just a few minutes. and tell you, so you get a chance to actually see a ham radio station, kind of in a field day kind of situation, put together, antenna put up, and see how ham radio works, and that's all. That'll be a lot of fun. I won't be able to be there for that, but I'll be at another station in the mountains, and we'll try to talk to you guys, so that the station I'm at in the mountains, we'll be able to communicate with you, so that'll be a lot of fun too. October 7th, Chapter 5, we'll try to do that completely, and Chapter 6, and then the last class is October 14th. Now these topics we'll cover as much as we can. We'll probably start with safety first, and then go into the regulations, licensing, and operating. We talk about don't memorize the answers, but in these areas, you kind of have to memorize the answers. I can help explain some electronics theory to you, etc. I don't know if anybody can explain governmental things. I work for the government. Actually, I'm a contractor at Fort Bragg. But anyway, I beat my head against the wall with that stuff every day. So sometimes the explanation for why is this is just because that's the way they wrote the rules. So again, I'll be glad to answer any questions, but you really need to cover that, and a lot of that is just memorization. So you need to you help yourself if you'll start covering that ahead of time and just kind of drill yourself in that kind of information so that you do have that covered. Then we'll have the exam in the afternoon. Carl will give you more information on the exam. Actually, I've got a little more right here. In the afternoon, 2 p.m., we'll be in this room. Ham radio exams are administered by volunteer examiners that are all ham operators. I can't do the exam because having been your instructor, I'm not allowed to do that. There is a fee of $14 for it. You have to have 2 forms of ID, and for kids that don't have driver's license and stuff, there's ways that we can handle that. There's 35 multiple choice questions, and you get 26 to pass. So that's the outline of how the ham radio stuff. And why do we have this test? Why isn't it just like a CD and we just give you a license, etc.? Well, radio is a finite space. There's only so much of it. And the FCC provides frequencies for aviation, marine, cellular, land, mobile, and in all of these radio services, if you want to work on a radio legally, you're supposed to be an FCC license, not a ham license, but what's called a commercial license. You're supposed to hold an FCC commercial license, a general radio telephone license. They don't allow legally these folks to work on their own equipment. In our case, we can work on our own equipment. In fact, we can build our own equipment from scratch. So we have some flexibility there, and partially they do that for the experimentation purposes. I mentioned that's one of our key purposes to ham radio. And so we get a chance to work on the radios, to build new radios, etc. And so they want people that know what they're doing. See, in these places, they may not modify or construct their own equipment, but we can do that. So it's important that we have some fundamentals. This won't turn you into an electrical engineer, nor will the general class test, nor will the extra class test. But it will give you a firm grounding. Secondly, there's many aspects to ham radio. A lot of the stuff I'll be talking about in here, you need to know if somebody were to give you a license. If something happened and you got the Presidential Medal of Freedom and it says, as a part of this, you can be a ham operator just without having any tests. There's still things you would need to know. About antennas, radios, etc. And so this test makes sure that you know those things, and we'll be covering many, many, many of those things in this class. So really, it's for the technology, for the freedom that you have as a ham to do things that people in other classes of radio can't do. And for all those reasons, there is a licensing structure that encourages you and requires to a certain extent that you learn at least the basics of the ham of radio and that sort of thing. So that's why really it's not them trying to be mean to cause you to have to pass a test is really, there's some sound reasoning behind it. And DX, by the way, we'll cover that, stands for distance. Actually in Morse code, which he talks about, which Carl just talked about, you abbreviate a lot of stuff because you're having to send every letter. And so DX stood for distance. And DXing is considered trying to talk to distant stations. So DX, a lot of people like to have a little sticker that says DX. And 73 means best regard. So a lot of times people will say 73. And I had a little circle, there's people that hand out little stickers that say 73. And I had one on the wall in my office. And my boss is a nice fellow, or actually he's not there anymore, but he was a nice fellow. But you may have seen stickers, little oval stickers on people's cars that say 13.1 or 26.2, which are people that have run either a full marathon, 26.2 miles, or half marathon, 13.1. He went over to my sticker and said 73. He said, Curt, I don't believe you've run a 73-mile marathon. I said, no, that's not what that means. so you never know what happens with things like that, but that's part of what you get into. Yes, whenever I took the test and everything, I had to know Morse code. I had to get up to 20 words a minute to get my extra class license. I will mention with this video, they will mention Morse code. This is an old video. It's literally, it's pushing 20 years old now, but it was done by Gary, KN4AQ, who is a professional videographer, so it's very well done, and we still use it, and 99% of what they say is still correct. Some of the prices they'll give you, you can get cheaper things now, etc. But it's an excellent video, which is why we still use it. And but they mentioned the code test, so don't worry about that. When you hear them mention the code test, it has been eliminated since then. It's around 2007, I think it was. They eliminated a code for every license. So if you hear them mention that, like you say, there's still areas of the frequencies that you can operate in the code, and lots of people still do it. I occasionally do it. Carl's a real big CW operator. He really likes
operating. About 90% of my operating, probably about 4 or 5 conversations a day I do in Morse code.
Yeah, so he's very big in it. I do use it just occasionally. But you can do that, but you do not have to do that. So when you hear that on the video, don't let that dissuade you. One other thing I'll mention is you go through your packets, go ahead and pull out the frequency list, because we'll be talking about something pretty quick. We get into that. Knowing the frequencies you're legal to operate on is very important. Because if you operate where you're not legal to operate on, the FCC will come and talk to you. So knowing where you're allowed to operate, and sir, you got yours. Hold it up so people will know what we're looking for. That's what you're looking for right there. Is what looks like that. It's got a picture of the or a map of the United States on the back, and it's got the frequencies on the front. And we actually will be talking about that in other parts of the class. So that's a pretty important thing, and will be helpful to you. Put it this way, I'll be honest with you. I don't have all the frequencies memorized anymore. I keep that chart close by on field day or any time just to make sure I know where I'm operating and where I'm legal operating. To be honest, they change some of the frequencies sometimes. So I try to keep the latest version. You can download that, by the way, and print it out on not as nice a paper as that, but whatever paper you have. And I try to keep the latest one in my ham shack, which is what we call the shack, is from the old days of having a Radio Shack, where you keep your equipment. So I try to keep it in my shack and whatnot, just so I'll know to be sure I'm operating on the correct frequencies. So anyway, this is the video. For those of you that are interested, this video is available on YouTube, as I understand it. So if you want to see it again at some point, you can do that. But here's the introduction to ham radio. We got the sound up.
when we teach this class is we begin with a demonstration. Because some of you know a lot about ham radio and some of you don't know too much about it. So to get everybody up to speed, we like to do a demonstration. But my friend Jeff is supposed to do the demonstration. He was supposed to bring the equipment. And I heard him on the radio earlier, but he's not here. And I'm not sure where he is. So I guess what we'll do is we'll just switch things around. There you go. Jeff! Jeff! Jeff!
Oh, hi, Garrett. I'm sorry, I was just listening to 20 meters. Oh, hey, everybody. I didn't see you there.
Jeff, the class is tonight. You're supposed to be here.
I know. I thought it would be easier to demonstrate some of ham radio from my shack here at home. Hey, why don't you bring everybody over and we'll give them a good demonstration.
Okay. I'll get my handy-talkie and I'll call you on the repeater. Okay?
Okay, I'll dial it in.
Let me see what this is all about. I can put my jacket on. It's kind of chilly out there. AC40, AC40, KN4IQ.
KN4IQ, this is AC40. Are you on live?
Yeah, I'm just walking out to the car now, Jeff. You know, it occurred to me, we're actually starting our demonstration now. So I guess maybe we better explain what we're doing.
Maybe we should explain how you were able to talk to me through the TV a minute ago.
That was just television magic. Kind of like the way we're going to change things from night into day for the rest of this day. But the rest of this is real, and we're talking on something called VHF FM with the assistance of a device called a repeater. And well, maybe we should explain what else is going on here, Jeff. Why don't you start by telling people about the Great Divide?
The great what?
You know, the Great Divide, the difference between HF and VHF amateur radio. Why don't you tell people about that and give me a call back when you're done.
Oh, okay. AC40 clear. What Gary's referring to is that there are really two types of amateur radio. There's the worldwide communication that takes place on shortwave radio, and then there's the local communication that happens on the VHF and UHF bands. The reason for this is that hams are allocated bands or small slices of frequencies throughout the radio spectrum. On some of those bands, the HF or high frequency bands, signals bounce off the ionosphere and can be heard thousands of miles away. But on the VHF, very high frequency, and UHF, ultra high frequency bands, signals don't travel nearly as far because they don't bounce off the ionosphere, and those bands are said to be good for local coverage, meaning out to about 100 miles or maybe a little bit more. That's the Great Divide that Gary is talking about. It's all the same big hobby of ham radio, but there are some very distinct differences in the way things sound and the way we use the spectrum on each side of that line between HF and VHF. In a future class, we'll go into a lot of detail about what the exact differences are. So far, Gary and I have been speaking on VHF, one of the local ham bands using FM, and we'll stick with that for the next part of our demonstration. KN4AQ, this is AC40.
Still there?
AC40, KN4AQ. I'm still here.
Out in the parking lot now, so I'm just in my car.
Okay, why don't you show everybody the stuff in your car?
Okay, sure.
This is a pretty simple installation, but I have a fairly deluxe radio that operates on 3 of the ham bands that we use for local communication. The control head is mounted down here on the dashboard, where it's easy to see. The radio itself is back here under the seat, and as you can see, it's fairly small. This particular radio costs about $800. The average run-of-the-mill radio, this brand, costs between $300 and $500, and you can buy used radios a whole bunch cheaper. My car's got a pretty good complement of antennas on it. Sometimes I call it a porcupine. You don't have to get this extreme when you're first getting started, though. In fact, what most people do is get an antenna like this. It's an antenna with a magnetic base, and they just plunk it on a piece of metal on the car and run the transmission line in through the weather seal on the door. I guess I should explain a little bit about this radio too. This is called a handy-talkie or HT or handheld radio. This one operates on 2 of our VHF and UHF, the local amateur bands. And a radio like this costs about $300. Now you can buy a simpler one starting at about $150.
and they top out at about $400. They're handy. Okay, Jeff, I just showed everybody my mobile equipment. Why don't you show them the VHF equipment there in your shack, and I'll get on the road.
Sure, I'll be back in a minute.
The radio I'm using to talk to Gary is another model of dual band radio with a VHF and a UHF band. It's fairly similar to the radio in his car, but a lot less fancy and much less expensive. A radio like this one new sells for between $350 and $450. The antenna for this radio is mounted on the side of the house and is about 17 feet tall. I think Gary would put an antenna like this on his car if he thought he could get away with it. And by the way, Gary wasn't being insulting when he called my house a shack. The room where a ham keeps his equipment is called the radio shack or ham shack or sometimes just the shack. Okay, Gary, I've showed him my stuff here. Now I guess we ought to show what we do with it all. AC4ZO.
Okay, Jeff, will do.
Well, you see, we're talking about VHF FM communication. That's the local communication. The signals don't bounce off the ionosphere, they don't go around the world, and they don't go through the middle of the planet either. And that means we can talk about as far as we can see. We call that line of sight communication. That looks like I can see about 3 blocks. I guess I'll have to say we can talk a little bit farther than we can actually see. In fact, the range between a radio like my mobile and just base station is 5 to 15 miles. We can stretch things out to about 25 to 30 miles, but that's called fringe territory. At that point, I can only talk to him when I'm on top of a hill. If I get behind a hill or a ridge or down in a low spot, I'll lose him. The higher we can get our antenna, the better we can talk. In fact, if we can get our antenna on top of a mountain or a tall tower, we can talk a lot farther.
We came all the way up to this mountain in Utah to illustrate the advantage of elevation in VHF and UHF line of sight communication. As you can see a long way from up here. And we can communicate a long way on VHF and UHF. So once again, the big advantage is elevation in VHF and UHF line of sight communication. Okay? All right, I haven't got enough. We can write off this trip. Yeah, let's go skiing.
But it's a little bit inconvenient to drive to the top of the mountain when you're around Raleigh. So we've created these devices that do the job for us. They're called repeaters. A repeater is a special transmitter and receiver combination that receives my signal and repeats or retransmits it so everybody else can hear it. We put the repeaters on top of tall towers or mountains or tall buildings, and they give us a lot greater coverage from our mobiles. There's a repeater on Mount Mitchell in western North Carolina, and here in Raleigh there's 3 ham radio repeaters on the WRAL tower and many more repeaters on the shorter towers around town. In fact, we happen to be driving by one right now. The NC State University radio phone has a repeater on this tower, just west of the Fairgrounds.
KN4AQ, still there, Jeff?
KN4AQ, this is AC4ZO. Still here?
Well, I explained a bunch about repeaters, and of course we've been talking through most of the time here. Tell you what, why don't you go start?
Search for some other activity and show what some real repeater activity sounds like.
Are you suggesting we depart from our carefully scripted dialogue and go looking for activity from other hands?
Sounds dangerous, doesn't it?
Well, I guess that's what editing is for. Okay, I'll look around and see what's happening.
Okay, call me back. KN4AQ.
Okay, let's tune around some other repeaters and see what kind of activity we can find.
It's no color to it, it's a natural finish.
Here's a few people talking. Let's see what they're talking about.
I'll believe the zero light. Man, you got a genuine Gibson with a factory orange sticker on it in a natural maple finish.
I think they're talking about Gibson guitars.
Yeah, well, that's for like the 14-year-olds who sit around and they're thinking that because there's nothing to do except sit around.
Here's some child psychologists here.
TV. Good enough there?
I just had to get through there.
Okay, well, we're just coming up on a good
you've taken the tour. What's next?
KN4AQ. Now, I've got one more thing to demonstrate. I'm going to show folks the auto patch, so I'll be right back.
What I'm going to show is a really useful accessory on repeaters. It's called Auto Patch. It's a phone line connected to the repeater, and it lets you make phone calls. Let's see how it works. KN4AQ, Auto Patch.
Dialing.
Just dial like a regular telephone. You should hear it ring in a second.
Hello?
Hey Jamie, this is Gary. I was just demonstrating the ham radio auto patch. How do you hear me?
All right, Gary. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. What are you up to?
Oh, just reading the paper on a lazy Saturday afternoon.
All right. Well, like I said, we're doing a demonstration of the ham radio auto patch. Now, I'm on the radio, but you're just on the telephone, so that's kind of strange.
That's correct. You sound great, though.
All right. Well, I'm going to be on my way over to visit in a little bit. Can I pick up anything?
All right, well, just bring along a gallon of milk. That'll be great.
Okay. See you a little bit later. Bye.
Great. Bye. Call complete.
Well, that's pretty cool. But there's a couple of things I want to emphasize about an auto patch. It's not a replacement for your cell phone, and here's why. Your calls aren't private. Anybody can listen. You can't use the auto patch or any ham radio for that matter for your business. That means you can't call your office to pick up messages, and you can't call them to tell them you're coming in late. You can only make local calls, and you can only place outgoing calls. You can't receive calls for most auto patch systems. And finally, ham radio, especially on VHF, is great for emergency communications. You can call 911 on the auto patch to report an accident or a problem on the highway. And we use ham radio and VHF for all kinds of public service activities like walkathons and bike-a-thons. Those guys need communications and we're the guys to give it to them. And when the weather's bad, you might want to monitor the Skywarn app and maybe even report some severe weather yourself. Our reports are relayed directly to the National Weather Service.
Right, weather copy. Just keep it posted. If you see anything there, heavy winds or anything, we'll just check it stuff on the radar. How far from Jordan Lake are you?
We also provide emergency communications to North Carolina Emergency Management during hurricanes and tornadoes and other regional disasters. AC40, KN4AQ.
AC40, I'm there. Go ahead. Okay, AC40 over there.
Hey, Gary, how you doing? Come on in.
Good to be here. Well, we have showed ham radio from the VHF side of things, but it's time to give equal time to the other side of the Great Divide and show folks what high-frequency operating is all about. I think when most people think about ham radio, they think about talking to strange, faraway, distant lands. Does that still happen?
It sure does, Gary. Hams talk all around the country and all around the world every day. But I didn't drag you over from the class to tell you about it. I drug you over to show you. Can we make some contacts?
Well, we sure can. But first, why don't we show people a little bit about the rest of your shack?
Okay, well, we started with these VHF and UHF radios, and here's the rest of the station. This is the HF, or high-frequency radio, that works on the worldwide ham bands. HF radios can be purchased new for about $600 for an entry-level radio, and going up to beyond $6,000. A radio like this sells new for about $2,000. You can buy equipment used and save a lot of money, or some simple equipment you can build yourself for almost nothing. Surrounding the radio are various pieces of support equipment. There's the power supply, which provides the power necessary to run almost all the equipment in the shack. And there's some simple test equipment, and many ham shacks employ the use of a computer. And of course, outside are the antennas.
Oh, I guess you better take a look at those.
Okay, let's go outside.
Field trip.
There are 5 antennas up in the air here. 3 of them are for VHF and 2 are for HF. This one is the simplest. It may be a little hard to see on video, but it's called a dipole, and it's just a long piece of wire running between trees across the lot. The cable dropping down from the middle is called the feed line, and that's what connects the antenna to the radio back in the shack. The dipole is used on high-frequency bands, and I've used it to talk to people all over the world. You can build a dipole for maybe $30 in parts.
How'd you get it up over the trees?
Well, I took this bow and arrow and tied a fishing line onto the arrow and shot the arrow over the trees and then used the fishing line to pull the antenna wire up.
Very clever.
This next antenna is called a beam, and it's also for the high frequency bands. It's kind of like a giant TV antenna, and it works like one too. It concentrates my signal in one direction, so I have to use the rotator below it to point it in the direction of the station I want to talk to. A new beam for the HF bands can cost several $100s. I got this one used for $50, but I had to drive out to the western part of the state to pick it up. This is another beam antenna, but this one is for VHF. If you want to know why it looks different from an HF beam, stick around. We'll be covering that in the class on antennas. And we've already seen this antenna, the vertical that works on both VHF and UHF. It costs a little over $200, but I have a homemade version that was about $25 in parts. And we've already seen your mobile antennas too.
Now, don't forget about this. This is an antenna. It's called a rubber duck. Jeff, if I can use an antenna this small and convenient, how come you have all these big antennas?
Well, Gary, because big antennas high in the sky work better than small antennas down low, but sometimes they're not very convenient. You wouldn't want one of these big verticals sticking out of your HT.
I guess you're right. Hey, why don't we go inside and try some operating?
Sounds good.
Let's go. You got a pretty good antenna department here, Jeff.
Thank you, Gary.
Well, there's one more thing that we haven't taken a look at here in the shack. It's this device over here, Jeff. What is this?
That's called a paddle.
What's it do?
Well, I use that along with its electronic unit for sending Morse code.
Morse code. Is that still alive?
It's alive and doing very well, thank you. In fact, ham radio operators use Morse code to make thousands of contacts every day. You know, Morse code was the original form of radio communication, not only for hams, but for all the users of the radio spectrum when radio was invented about 100 years ago. Today, there's very little commercial use of Morse code, but many hams still love it. It's my favorite form of communication.
Well, in honor of Morse code, and because it's your favorite mode of communication, why don't we start our demonstration with that? Perhaps you can show us a little Morse code operating and maybe translate it back into English for us.
Okay, well, let's have a listen at what a busy man sounds like. As I turn across, you can hear some Morse code signals in there. I heard that guy just a minute ago. He's in Belgium. There's a lot of stations from Europe that are very strong right now. He's in Spain. Let's try to make a contact now. I've checked the frequency to make sure it's clear, and I'm about to call CQ. Here's somebody answering our call here. This is F5MQW. That would be in France, I can tell because of the F at the beginning of the call sign. Let me give him a little information about us here. First I'll tell him where Raleigh is. Just tell him it's in North Carolina and that the weather here is sunny. And about 10 degrees C, 10 degrees centigrade. And now it's his turn to send. His name is Patrick, and he's about to send his location. Okay, here's his location. The town is spelled Lacras, I guess. communities in the southern part of France. Most Morse code contacts begin by exchanging some basic information, and after that's done, the conversation might turn in any direction. Sometimes the foreign station wants more information about our electronics in our station, or maybe they want to know something about the area of the country we live in. Perhaps how our nearby city of Raleigh might be different from their city of Barcelona or Rome or wherever.
Hey Jeff, hams really are keeping Morse code alive.
We sure are. I hope it's around for a long time. And while the ability to use Morse code is required for some ham licenses, it isn't required for every ham license, so let's not worry about it just yet. Could we try a voice contact?
Okay, I have found the microphone, pulled it out from where you keep it in. May I do the honors?
Sure.
First, let's tune across a busy phone band and see what it sounds like. Come on, Jim, let's take a look. I think this station is in Spain. Let's see if we can get one going. Echo Alpha 3, Quebec Papa. This is Kilo November 4, Alpha Quebec. Kilo November 4, Alpha Quebec. Good afternoon, Gino. Good to talk to you. You've got a good signal here in the United States. My name is Gary, Golf Alpha Romeo Yankee, Gary, and I'm located near Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh is the capital city of North Carolina. Your signal report here is 5 by 7, and we're making a short demonstration for an amateur radio class. I wonder if you'd like to say hello to some students in a ham radio class here in the Raleigh area. Go ahead.
Now here on 15, and the signal's coming very strong from the safe side. Okay, anything at 3,500, 150 knots from the icon 775 natural devices from like that. Latinos are puramente
Okay, Gino, good solid signal here. Echo Alpha 3, Quebec Peter. This is Kilo November 4, Alpha Quebec. Good solid signal, and appreciate you saying hello to everybody here in the class. Good to talk to you this morning, and perhaps we'll get a chance to contact a little bit later on when we're not pressed for time getting a demonstration for the class. 73, PA3, QP, KN4AQ.
Thank you very much for the contact. Good afternoon, Barcelona. And this is the hospital and the
Pretty cool, Spain. We've seen Morse code in action.
You have to know that, and that's one that doesn't work on the threes. So, are you ready now?
I think it is. It's the red light's blinking. That says recording. So
Okay.
I think we're good. Thank
Well,
you.
anyway, so this, the giga, like I say, is 10 to the 9th power for those of you that know exponents, or like I say, a trillion or a billion, and then million, and then thousand. Then centa is the 100th, milli is a 1,000th, micro is a millionth, nanos a billionth, and pico would be a trillionth, 10 to the minus 12. But see how awkward it would be if you had to write that number very often, whereas you could say 1 picofarad, farad is used in capacitance, and it would be much easier. And these are the symbols. These are actually Greek letters. Most of them are. K is is not. But anyway, some of these are Greek, so that's not an N, that's, I can't remember the Greek name. But anyway, that's, by the way, in the energy world, we get, and I'll just mention this to you very briefly, we write capital M for mega, but the British, if you deal with British thermal units, BTUs, within the Department of Defense and within the Department of Energy, I used to work for the Department of Energy, now I work for the Department of Defense through a contractor, but I work for the Department of Energy. The standard for 1 million BTU is little m, little n, m, so it's like 1,000 BTU. But the trick is, you will see big M BTU in stuff and BTU. So in that particular case, there's no standard, it just depends on who wrote it. And I have had documents that I wrote essentially chastised. When I use this, they said you should have used this. Then I've used this sometimes, they said you should have used this. Sometimes you just can't win, and you say, well, I'll use whatever you ask me to use. But anyway.
Put a parentheses next time.
That's right, yeah, that's what I need. Or just spell it out. I just don't use mega, just put, like I said, a bunch of zeros on it. But anyway, these are terms that you need to know, and you need to get pretty comfortable with them, because again, you will get something that is micro units, microfarads, or microvolts. And as we'll see in just a minute, for some of the calculations we're going to do, and we don't do real complex calculations in here, but we do some, you have to be able to convert those to the original unit to accurately do the calculation. So here we have different areas, things that you might be measuring or dealing with in electronics. Current, the symbol is I. Why is the symbol for current I? It's really from the French, intensity de voltage, courant. So I stands for intensity. Actually, AMP, Mr. AMP himself used that phrase, intensity de courant. And so that's why I is used for current. And they're most often you'll see them in microamps or milliamps, really most often milliamps, a lot of that. And some amps in general. Voltage, E stands, as we'll get into a little later, for electromotive force, which is kind of the official phrase for voltage. And you can go all over the place with voltages, from microvolts to megavolts, if you work for not Progress Energy or Duke Power or whatever. Resistance is in ohms, and there's milliohms and mega ohms there, so you have huge differences in what you might wind up doing in terms of ohms. Then frequency is in hertz. Used to be, I'm old enough, used to be cycles per second, but we had to honor Mr. Hertz, so now it's in hertz, and you can have kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and a lot of conversions we'll be doing for the test, so to speak, is in frequency, because that's something we're in. You have to kind of be able to do this kind of in your head, and the one I give you often is 3923, and this is kilohertz. But the same frequency is 3.933 megahertz. Well, the frequency that's for is what's called the Tar Heel Emergency Net, which I haven't actually been involved with much recently, but used to be very involved with. And that's been their frequency for years. But this is the same thing. And so if somebody said, what is the frequency of the Tar Heel Emergency Net? Probably I'd say 3923 and kilohertz, because I know that's in the 80 meter band, we'll get into that. But if somebody said 3.923, I've got to be able to pretty immediately know, well, that's the same as 3,923 kilohertz. So the ability to switch back and forth, particularly in frequencies, it can become pretty important because people will give you frequencies in various denominations, so to speak, either kilohertz or megahertz, and your ability to convert back and forth becomes pretty important. Okay, let's take some questions here. Okay, what is in order from largest to smallest? Which is the largest of that group that are there, from largest to smallest? So which is the largest one there? Giga, that's right. Then what would be next? Mega, that's right. Then after that? Kilo. Then what's next after that? Milli, that's right, 1,000. Then next? Micro. And then the smallest? Nano. Where does centi fit in? Well,
Breaks from 1,000 to 100.
that's right, between 1,000 and the regular unit and 1,000 units. Basic unit and 1,000. Centi is, basic 1,000, because it's a 100th, like centimeter. So, how do these prefixes relate to each other in terms of magnitude or size?
Thousands.
There's thousands, that's right. In fact, I didn't. So here it shows you've got I didn't point this out as much, but you drop, essentially, for getting the centi, you get 3 decimal places here or 3 zeros here every time you go up or down. It's either 3 more zeros or 3 less zeros. So you're dealing with essentially changes of 1,000 or 1,000 that get you there. Okay, how many milliamperes is 2.5 amperes? 25. All right. Milliamperes is 1,000th of an amp. So if you have thousandths of an amp, 2.5 amps is, in thousandths of an amp, will be 2,500. Does everybody understand how that would be done? Okay, what is 2,500,000 hertz in megahertz? All right, in megahertz, that would be 2.5 megahertz. What would it be in kilohertz? 2,500, again, just like we're talking about with the frequencies. And that's something, again, you will bump into quite a bit. How many volts are equal to 3.5 kilovolts? 3,500, that's right. How many volts are equal to 7 microvolts? That's very good. Yes, a lot of zeros in front of it. Essentially, it's a millionth of a volt. 7 millionths of a volt. A microvolt is 1 millionth of a volt, so 7 of them will be 7 millionths of a volt. How many watts are equal to 300 milliwatts? 0.3. That's right. That'd be 3/10 of a watt. So 300 again. Milliwatts are thousandths. You got 3 of the thousandths, which would be like 3/10 of a full watt. Okay, if an ammeter is calibrated in amperes and it's used to measure a 4,700 milliampere circuit, what reading would it show?
4.7.
Okay, it's got 4,700 milliamps, so 4,700 thousandths of an amp would be 4.7 amps. You just move the decimal over. Okay, if a frequency readout calibrated in megahertz show a reading of 4.835 megahertz, what would it show if it was calibrated in kilohertz?
4,835.
That's right, 4,835. All right, here's one that gets a little tougher. How many microfarads are 6 million picofarads?
6,000.
Be 6, that's right, it would be 6. 6 microfarads. Again, we'll get back to here. Yeah, there we go, right there. So, nano is, I forget what pico. Yeah, pico was that many zeros. and we're going to micros, so essentially, we would go over 3. So in this particular case, you go over 3, it'd be 6 million, and so it would wind up being 6. So this is something you need to get very comfortable with. And as we can see, I don't deal with it every day, and it can be kind of confusing if you don't deal with it every day. You have to sit there and think about it. But if you can just think of jumping the number of 3 zeros each time, that helps you. And in this particular case, you've got 3 decimal places here. If you're in the ones below 1, then that gets you down into those areas. So it can be confusing, and so you want to practice it pretty well to where you get comfortable with it. Again, there's only 2 or 3 questions, but you need to, there's only 2 or 3 questions that may be on it, but you need to get familiar enough that you can handle the switches back and forth. 28,400 kilohertz is what in megahertz? That's our 28.4. Okay, if a frequency readout has a reading of 3625 megahertz, what is that frequency in gigahertz? That's right, 3.625. For me, at least, it's easier if you're dealing with the bigger numbers, the ones over a 1 rather than the partial ones, because I don't deal with them that much. So at any of those, you just need to practice a little bit, and like I say, it's not hard. It's just a matter of wrapping your mind around the fact that the order of magnitude of what you're doing. Okay. AC current changes direction continuously, alternating current. Reversing the battery in this particular case, if you wanted to use a battery to make AC current, you would just reverse the battery polarity periodically, and that would produce an alternating current for you. Okay, AC versus DC, or DC versus AC. Well, Mr. Edison, Thomas Edison, was heavily into DC and promoted it all over the place. Westinghouse, with a technical guy named Tesla working for him, was a big proponent of alternating current, and they couldn't agree on which one was best. One would say one was more dangerous than the other, and they used all kinds of different arguments to push for their preferred type. It turns out we need both of them. AC is used for generating and transmitting power and communication, so we've got to have AC. But then again, most of the electronic circuits are done in DC. So essentially, generally, you have DC in small circuits and microcircuits, and usually DC in volts are hundreds of volts at max, whereas AC is done in thousands and tens of thousands of volts. So for massive power, you tend to use it in AC, and for smaller power, you tend to use that as DC. Okay. Change to the opposite direction and back each direction is 1 cycle, and the number of cycles per second is the frequency. Again, it used to be known as cycles per second or kilocycles per second, kilocycles. 1,000 cycles per second is 1 kilohertz. Remember, so 1,000 hertz, that would be 1,000 cycles would be the same as 1,000 hertz. That is equal to 1 kilohertz. The power supplied to our homes alternates at 60 hertz. That's 60 cycles per second. Over in Europe, it's primarily 50 hertz. So, but here we use 60. Radio communications occurs at frequencies starting at 10 kilohertz, going to several hundred gigahertz. So, the frequency that we have at 60 hertz is not a radio frequency, because essentially the radio frequency actually starts lower than 10 kilohertz. But anyway, in that ballpark to several hundred gigahertz. Okay. Frequency and wavelength. Frequency is like a rock in a pond. You throw a rock into a pond and waves propagate out from it. The number of rocks per second is the frequency in F. And note that all the waves travel at the same speed. The distance between the waves here is the wavelength. And we mentioned wavelength, it's used mainly for tradition more than anything else. Although we need to know the distance here and wavelength for antennas and things like that, but we don't often call it that. But actually the bands are known. When I say 80 meters is an average wavelength for that frequency band. 40 meters is average wavelength for that frequency band. So that's how the names came about. Okay, frequency and wavelength. Essentially, in meters, you take 300, divide the frequency in megahertz. And again, this is helpful to remember. If it says megahertz, you got to remember it's megahertz. Or if you want to know the frequency in megahertz and how many meters, so somebody do that for me. Somebody divide 300 by 80. You got a calculator real quick. That would be 80 meters, 300.
3.75.
3.75, okay. 3.75 is actually 80 meters, megahertz. Now what we call the 80 meter band is 3.5 to 4.0. But that's the 80 meter band, not the single wavelength for 80 meters is 3.75. But we just use that phrase for where, you could say like, I'm going to Greensboro. Well, that didn't tell you where within Greensboro I'm going. So if I'm on the 80 meter band, actually I haven't told you a whole, I need to tell you more than that. Say I'll meet you on 80 meters tonight at 8 o'clock, then I still haven't told you exactly where I'm going. I could be anywhere within this range.
You're giving me the city, but not the street address.
That's right, that's right, that's right. So this is the 80 meter band, and that's really what we always say. Again, we shorten things out, but the 80 meter band, this is 80 meter band. So sometimes in using shortcuts, it makes it more, so this is just a name we've hung on to those range of frequencies. And so that's the 80 meter band. But there's only one wavelength for a given frequency. So that's, so anyway, this says it here, identified by their approximate wavelength in meters.
And part of that is history. Back
That's
in the
right,
old
that's
days,
right,
we did
yeah.
not have the ability to measure our frequencies with any kind of accuracy. So in the
Right.
1920s, when this nomenclature was being set up, the fact that we would know we were on the wavelength of 80 meters was pretty good.
Right.
Today, we can get down to the kilohertz as to what frequency.
Oh,
we're
yeah,
on.
exactly.
But we still use the old nomenclature that was very broad from back in the days when that's the best we could do.
Right, yes.
Get back to the simple part. When you change the frequency, you change the wavelength.
That's right.
When you change the wavelength, you change the frequency.
That's right. They're both the same name. They're different names for the same thing. So, but where, like I said, where it could get a little confusing is like we say, I'm going to Greensboro. The 80 meter band is Greensboro, 3.75 megahertz. The 80 meters itself is one frequency within the band, or like he was saying, one street in Greensboro. So this is the radio spectrum. You have, and the thing that you need to remember here is, for whatever reason, and that has to be tradition too, it's based on threes. Essentially, the HF bands, what hams call HF, which is high frequency, what a lot of other people call short wave, is 3 to 30 megahertz. Why is it not 1 to 10? Again, tradition, you know. That little guy singing from the movie, Fiddler on the Roof. Tradition is that. And the other trick is, why in the world, I mean, we've got all these really, really, really high frequencies. Why is this called high frequency? Because it started being called high frequency around 1920. And in 1920, it was considered a high frequency. They wouldn't have believed you could even transmit stuff up in this area back in that time frame. So Again, you've got very low frequency, that's 3 to 30. Low frequency, 30 to 300 kilohertz. Now note, we're in kilohertz here. Then medium frequency is 300 kilohertz to 3 megahertz. How many kilohertz would that be? 300 to 3,000 kilohertz. So
0.3 megahertz to 3 megahertz.
that's right, 0.3 megahertz to 3 megahertz. Then now we're going to just 100%, and we're all using megahertz now. As we said, the HF band or shortwave bands are 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz. Then VHF, very high frequency, is 30 megahertz to 300 megahertz. Then ultra high frequency, UHF, is 300 megahertz to 3,000 megahertz, but rather than calling it 3,000 megahertz, we'll call it 3 gigahertz. Then the super high frequency, 3 gigahertz to 30, then extremely high is 30 gigahertz to 300 gigahertz. And then down below 30 is actually in the audio frequency range. That's why if you were talking about your 60 hertz there, which is down in that range, is you can hear a buzz if you get 60 hertz power into your radio, you hear a hum because that's actually in the audio range. So this is another thing that's a little confusing. Low frequencies have really long wavelengths. So 300 divided, what is 300 divided by 144? 144 is in the 2 meter band.
2.083.
So 144 megahertz, 2.083. And that's what we call that part of the 2 meter band, 2.083. So think of the antenna. So the antenna, if you had a full wave antenna for 144 megahertz, it'd be 2.083 meters long. Your full wave antenna at 3.75 is 80 meters long. So it takes a really, really big antenna for 80 meters. They were kind of alluding to that on the video. And you have a much smaller antenna be cut for full wave or half wave or whatever on 2 meters. So that's another fact that we bump into. We have to know that to make antennas for ourselves for whatever frequency we want. We also just practically have to know, well, if I'm going to put up something for 80 meters, I got to have some space in the backyard. Now there are ways you can get around that a little bit. Nothing's free, but there's ways you can make a smaller antenna work on a lower frequency, but that's a little more complex than what we're getting into right now. So, this is another way of showing the spectrum, very low up through extremely high frequency. Again, start with a 3 and spans a decade factor and ends with a 3. So, just remember when you're looking at this, I think this is out of the book, I'm pretty sure this is out of the book. Note when you make that jump from kilohertz to megahertz. And that's where you need to be able to throw that switch in your mind to know that this 3 megahertz is 3,000 kilohertz. Okay, let's review. What is the name for the distance a radio wave travels during one complete cycle? Wavelength, that's right. How fast does a radio wave travel through free space? Speed of light, which is 300 million meters per second. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, in this particular case, 3 million meters per second. How does the wavelength of a radio wave relate to its frequency? Okay, as
It's inversely.
Shorter the
That's
wavelength,
right.
the higher
The higher
the
the
frequency.
frequency, that's right. The shorter the wavelength, just like we're talking about here.
Further the distance.
144 megahertz is much, much higher than 3.75 megahertz. But 3.75 megahertz is 80 meters in length, where 144 is 2.083 meters in length.
The lower, the longer.
That's right, the lower the longer, right. What is the formula for converting frequency to approximate wavelength in meters? 300 divided by the frequency. Remember, yeah, so you take 300 and divide by the frequency. What property of radio waves is often used to identify different frequency bands? The approximate wavelength in meters. And what are the frequency limits of the VHF spectrum? Or VHF is just above HF. What did we say HF? HF's the one that I know, again, got burned in my brain. HF is 3 to 30.
30 to 300 megahertz.
So then VHF just above that is 30 to 300. Okay. What are the frequency limits of the UHF spectrum? That's our 300 megahertz to 3,000 megahertz. What frequency range is referred to as HF? 3 to 30, yeah, 3 to 30, 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz. A term disguises the number of times per second that an alternating current reverses direction. Hertz. Frequency, that's right. What is the unit of frequency? Hertz, that's right. What does the abbreviation RF refer to? We didn't get into that. Radio frequency. Now here we go, now we're getting in some graphs. We're not going to spend quite as much time on all this as Mike put information in here, but we aren't going to cover this because we're trying to cover enough to make sure we cover what you need to know. So if you plot numbers and make a plot for the sine wave, that's what a sine wave looks like. And you may also note that if you look on this starts at 0, so you've actually got negative voltage here and positive voltage. This particular goes from minus 100 to plus 100 and back and forth. And this is what a sine wave plotted actually looks like. So in this particular case, the amplitude is on the vertical scale. We need to know about amplitude of a sine wave because that becomes important in how we put information onto the sine wave. So in this particular case, the 2 volt peak. Now if you look at this, you say that looks like a 1 volt peak. Remember, we're going minus 1 volt to plus 1 volt, which gives you a 2 volt peak on the vertical scale. Again, 1 plus 1 to minus 1 is the amplitude. Time here is on the horizontal scale. In this particular case, it's 60 nanoseconds. Okay, the duration of the cycle is 1 period. Here you have 4 cycles in 4.5 divisions, and which is our 6 nanoseconds each. You don't really, I'm 99% sure you don't have to know this, so we will skip over that. Harmonics is something that's very important. If you put out a signal at 4 megahertz, you're right at the top of the 80 meter band. In fact, you shouldn't be on 4 megahertz exactly. You are, without even trying, going to put out a signal at 8 megahertz at
16.
Well, actually 6, but actually it's at 12. You'll do it 12, 16, etc. They're what's called harmonics of the fundamental frequency. So you've got the green there shows the fundamental frequency. In this particular case, shows second harmonics. Red shows third harmonics. And they are something we have to deal with. If I'm building a transmitter and I want to put out a signal on 44 megahertz, I'm getting confused here myself. Megahertz. I got to know it's going to naturally put out some energy at these frequencies. Well, first of all, as a ham, I'm not licensed at 8 megahertz. So I gotta be sure that something is done, filtering, we'll get into that, to make sure that signal does not get out, or at least it gets out only in very, very microscopic amounts. So what we're trying to do here is communicate with the radios. If all we ever got on the radio was just beep, wouldn't get a lot of interest if it was just a steady tone. So we want to put information on the signal somehow. So modulation is changing the carrier signal in some way so that we send information. And if you've got like a light that's always on, there's no information. But it very easily can have information. Essentially, don't even forget about Morse code. It's just one blink is yes and two blinks is no. That's information. So it can be literally that simple, just one blink less, yes, two blinks no. Then you get into more sophisticated than that. So the carrier signal is what we're modulating. In this particular case, the carrier signal would be the light. And how we modulate it depends on what information we're putting on it. Okay, no unmodulated carrier has no information. That's just a continuous sine wave or continuous wave, what we call CW, and it would sound like just a tone. Again, it would be pretty boring to listen to. But if we break it up, then we can actually put information on it. But first of all, we talked about this briefly. Sine waves are characterized by amplitude, frequency, and phase. Modulation is a process of modifying one or more of those properties to put information on it. So we can change the amplitude, we can change the frequency, or we can change the phase. Okay, phase is considered in degrees. We won't get into this much. Essentially, it's like if you had two cars passing, it's the relative position of the two waves, and as they pass each other. It's done in degrees. The degrees is based upon trigonometry, and that gets more involved than we have to for this, so we won't go any further. Amplitude modulation, AM, the information signals used to vary the amplitude of the RF signal. By the way, single sideband, SSB, is a type of AM modulation. It's what's called suppressed carrier AM modulation. But anyway, single sideband is a part of that, and this is how you put information on that. So, okay, by turning the carrier on and off, you can send Morse code. And that's what we call a continuous wave. It's a continuous wave that we interrupt for either long periods. I mean, we make a long period like a dee, which is a da, or a short period dee, with a little beep. So that's how you get continuous wave. Is also what people call Morse code, or CW is also, again, another name for Morse code. Frequency modulation is where the information signal changes with the carrier frequency. The deviation is how much the carrier frequency varies, and deviation varies with the modulating signal amplitude. So again, we're changing not the amplitude anymore, but we're changing how far together the frequency between these different waves. And so one thing that's a practical aspect of this is if you're talking too close to the microphone, you may produce over deviation and interfere with nearby signals. So that's something you just need to know. People like me are the worst for over deviating because we tend to speak with a loud voice. So in many cases, I need to hold it further away, or sometimes talk into it across the microphone rather than straight into the microphone to keep from over deviating. So that's something that we have to remember, and that's something that you need to know as a good operator so that you can keep your signal where it sounds good and doesn't provide interference. Phase modulation is a little more complicated, but it's where you have green signal is the constant reference signal. The red signal is the resulting carrier after you've imposed information on that. Both FM frequency modulations have constant amplitude, so you see that they've got constant amplitude. But in phase modulation, the deviation is proportional to the modulating amplitude and frequency. So essentially, how far out of phase these are is how you send the frequency. Now that becomes very complicated to determine, which is why phase modulation's only recently come into use. But it is a good way to put information on a signal, and it allows us to put information on a signal that is less susceptible to some types of interference than other types would be. So phase modulation becomes very important. It's primarily used for the digital type signals that they mentioned briefly, like packet and the digital computer to computer type signals on the radio. Phase modulation is now often used for that. In fact, here it shows phase modulation in the digital world, binary phase shift keying, or BPSK. You got zeros and ones, and they're part of the transmitted signal. Okay, the bandwidth, that becomes very important to us in our operating. Okay, we just said, I use 80 meters a lot. It's just easy, winds up being easy to use. 3.5 to 4.0 megahertz. And you can see it on your piece of paper that he gave you, the band plan. Okay, this is a small, relatively small piece of territory in the radio world. So, how many signals can we fit in this space? Well, it depends on the bandwidth of the signals. Some signals are wide, some signals are narrow. As you see here, this is an unmodulated carrier at 146.52. This is actually on 2 meters, how he's got it. And you see it doesn't take up much space. It's very narrow. Once you start putting information on there, he just put audio tones on it, look how much broader it gets. So suddenly, how many of these could we pack into this? Well, we could pack, I don't know, 10, 20, something like that. Maybe 10 on each side, maybe 8 on each side or something. How many of these could we pack in the same breath? We couldn't even get 2 in there. So as you put information on it, it takes up more bandwidth. Well, in this particular case, the signal's about 15 kilohertz wide. So obviously bandwidth is important to us. The narrower the bandwidth we get, the more signals we can put on a given piece of radio real estate. So that becomes pretty important. It also becomes important because a given amount of power will get this signal through better than this signal. The more information you pack onto the signal, the more power it takes to get that signal through a given area, a given distance. So if you have a narrow bandwidth, generally it will go further for the same amount of power. Okay? Now sidebands, if you saw the picture here, you see the signal in the middle and then on either side, you may notice that these are pretty much a mirror of each other. Not a perfect mirror, but this half is about the same as that half. So that shows you got your upper and lower sideband. You got your carrier frequency, that would be equivalent to this. And you got lower sideband down here, an upper sideband down here, which varies the amplitude and frequency with the information. So if they're virtually mirrors of each other, why do we have to have both of them? Well, the answer is we don't have to have both of them. That's why we can have single sideband that has just lower sideband, just that part, or just that part. And obviously, just as obviously, it only takes up half the bandwidth if you've just got one sideband. So it takes up less space. Also, it will go further with the same amount of power. So you've got an advantage there. And so there's all kinds of reasons why you might want to use single sideband. We'll get into some of the reasons that aren't as good in just a minute. But anyway, when we deal with bandwidth, I mentioned just a few minutes ago, if we were at 4.0, well, 4.0 megahertz is at the top of the band. So what if we were here, well, in this particular case, this is 28.447. So we have to know that the top end of our signal is going to be right at 28,500. Well, actually, as a technician, your legal part in the 10-meter band ends at 28,500 is your legal bandwidth on 10 meters. Again, this is on the piece of paper that you have. So this is fine where you are now with your frequency showing 28.447. What happened if you moved it up to 29? Well, at 29, all this shifts over and you're going to be hanging out. You're going to put signal out above 28.5 megahertz. Everybody understand that as you move it over? Well, the FCC is not going to like that because you won't be legal to put out a signal over 28.5 megahertz. Just like I wouldn't be legal if I put one out over 4 megahertz here on 80 meters. I'm not legally allowed to do that. So I can't just dial the dial in at 4 megahertz and say, well, I'm legal on 4 megahertz, I can just transmit. I got to keep in mind the width of my signal and where it is projecting within the spectrum to make sure that my entire energy, FCC, all the energy must be in band. And so all the energy from my signal has to be within the area that I'm allocated.
Curt, one way I like to think of that is, we often say, what frequency are you transmitting on? It would be more properly to say, what frequencies are you transmitting
Right,
on?
that's
Your
correct.
signal is really more than one individual frequency.
Exactly. You're transmitting over a range of frequencies. And depending on AM, single sideband, FM, whatever, depends on the width of frequencies that you're transmitting on.
Curt, I have a question. So
Yeah.
if in this scenario you have up here with this frequency, if you moved it to 29, but you stayed on a single sideband, but you said lower single sideband, would you, so you're only gonna use half of that?
That's right.
Then
Technically,
you probably-
if you roll
it'd probably work,
lower
right?
sideband, you'd be down here. This is
Right.
carrier frequency, which is what is shown to display. So you'd be down there, so you could move that up. I
If you
think.
move it almost the whole, you could move it almost all the way up to.
That's right, almost,
28.5
yeah.
If you're using the lower single
Right.
sideband.
There is a great group of people, by the way, on 80 meters, typically you operate on lower sideband. And there's a group of people that operate at 3998, I believe it is, 3998, which just puts them right up at the very top. I probably wouldn't be quite that close, but they like to live dangerously. So. But anyway, no, I mean, they hang out there. As far as I know, nobody gives them any problem. But yeah, you could do that. I mean, that's where you have to know the difference between being on upper sideband or lower sideband. But because the whole point is that you don't want to put any energy out here where I'm not legally allowed to put any energy out. So if I'm on lower sideband and I come right up to here, then my energy is staying over here. If my radio is in good shape and this carrier suppress, remember, actually the radio is making both sidebands and then it's filtering one out. Heaven forbid that my filter doesn't work or not working well that day.
That's the Volkswagen to the Mercedes.
That's right, you're a part of it, yeah. So, generally speaking, like I say, the 3998 folks are going to be in pretty good shape, but.
They got money to save.
Yeah. But that's what you got to keep in mind is where is your signal occurring? This is what's showing up on the radio. But you got to keep in mind where is my signal compared to that particular number. Just because you dial that number up and it's within the numbers that you're allowed to have does not 100%, but make sure that you're legal. You've got to be sure that you keep that band edge and the width of your signal in mind. Okay, here's some typical bandwidth. I'll go ahead and tip you off that they are a little confused in one area, and you have to remember this for the test. Single sideband voice has a typical bandwidth of 2 to 3 kilohertz. Well, I bolded 3 kilohertz here because on these questions, it will say 3 kilohertz. There are other questions we will cover on other classes where it will say about 2.4 kilohertz. So you've got to know that they ask questions in different places, and essentially in one case they'll say single sideband is about 3 kilohertz, and another place they'll talk about 2.4 kilohertz. So just be aware of that. In this particular case, they show it as being digital versus voice, but they aren't clear about that in some of the other ones. But anyway, amateur voice is about 6 kilohertz wide, AM broadcast about 10. That's why, because there's more information. We are not allowed to and do not transmit music. They do transmit music, so they want more fidelity. And with more information, fidelity, those higher notes and higher musical value that you put in there requires greater bandwidth. Commercial video broadcast, look at this, 6 megahertz. That is a huge amount of real estate. 6 megahertz, this is half a megahertz here, 80 meters is. So 6 megahertz would take 12 times as large as 80 meters just for one video signal. Think about that. That's why they're not on 80 meters. There's no TV broadcast in that area, or at least not regular type TV. Again, we say single sideband voice, 2 to 3 kilohertz, 3 being the number you want to remember. Digital, half to 3 kilohertz, 2.4 kilohertz, you want to remember for that. CW, 100 hertz to 500 hertz. 500 hertz is kind of the rough number people use and also what they ask in the questions, so you want to be aware of that. FM amateur is 5 kilohertz to about 15 kilohertz. Then FM broadcast, again, with all the high fidelity they want to broadcast, is about 150 kilohertz. Yes?
How did the big switch to digital television affect that?
It's more efficient. It puts more data into the same bandwidth. They've got the same bandwidths they had, but they're putting, that's why you have WRAL2 and WRAL3 now that you never used to have. I mean, you're not old enough to remember we didn't used to have that, but we did. WRAL used to be just one signal. And now they actually put out signals with other programming on it, on the other, what they call it, 0.2 and 0.3. And that's because they can pack more information into that given bandwidth. That's
Are they also on UHF now?
Pardon?
Are they all on UHF now?
No, there's still a few that are on VHF. Why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of the amateur band or subband? All right, actually, they mentioned a few. This is one of those all of the above questions where you'll have several answers and the correct answer is all of the above. One thing we didn't mention, two things we didn't mention, and it's impossible to believe now with our new radios, but the dial on your radio might be wrong. We assume that they're almost perfect now, but in the old days we didn't assume that. They weren't nearly as good. But anyway, so you've got to allow for calibration error in the transmitter frequency display. It might not be exactly 100% accurate. Secondly, is the one that we talked about mainly, so that the modulation of the sidebands don't extend beyond the band edge. And 3, I heard Carl talking about this, some of the older radios. Old radios used to drift a little bit.
I drift all over the place.
That's right. So, in fact, that almost all old tube radios, they'd say let them warm up for 30 minutes before you really start using them. Because the tubes and all have to get up to temperature and then they maintain some pretty good stability. But even with that, they would tend to drift a little bit. So if you were right at the edge of the band and your radio drifted a little bit, it might drift out of band. So all of those reasons are reasons that are good for reasons why you don't want to be exactly at the edge of the band. What determines the amount of deviation of an FM versus a phase modulation signal? The amplitude of the modulating system. We talked about amplitude modulation, but even with FM, what I'm doing first here in this microphone is making an amplitude modulation signal in the microphone, which is then converted to frequency modulation at the radio level. So the answer here is it's the amplitude of the modulating signal that causes the deviation, which causes the information to be transmitted. What happens when the deviation of an FM transmitter is increased? It occupies more bandwidth. What could cause your FM signal to interfere with stations on nearby frequencies? Is the microphone gain is too high, causing over deviation? Kind of the same thing we talked about before. If you over deviate, you cause your bandwidth is bigger than it's supposed to be, and it might overlap into another frequency that it's not supposed to, where it would interfere with somebody. So, what is a form of amplitude modulation?
Single sideband.
Single sideband, that's right. That's single sideband is a form of amplitude modulation. What type of modulation is commonly used for VHF packet radio transmissions? FM, that's right, and FM is also used for packet radio. What type of voice mode is most often used for long distance or weak signal contacts on the UHF-VHF bands? Single sideband, that's right, because it goes further with the same amount of power. What type of modulation is commonly used for VHF-UHF voice repeaters? FM, that's right, that's right. Sounds better and they've got the bandwidth available. Which of the following types of emission has the lowest bandwidth? Well, of the ones we've covered, which one's the lowest bandwidth? Morse code. What is another name for Morse code? CW, that's right. CW is the answer they're going to ask for. Another story here. Which sideband is typically used for 10-meter HF, UHF, VHF single sideband communication? Upper sideband, that's right. What is the primary advantage of single sideband over FM for voice transmissions? Less bandwidth in this particular case. You can get more signals over the same. Single sideband, the official answer is single sideband signals have lower band or narrower bandwidth. What is the approximate bandwidth of a single sideband voice signal? 3 kilohertz, that's the number they want to know. Later they will want to know like 2.4 kilohertz, but for the moment they want 3 kilohertz. What's the approximate bandwidth of an FM repeater, of a VHF repeater FM phone signal? It's 10 to 15 kilohertz. 10 to 15 kilohertz. Mention this briefly. What's the typical bandwidth of analog fast scan TV transmissions? The answer is 6 megahertz. 6 megahertz, typical bandwidth of analog fast scan TV transmissions on the 70 centimeter band. And what's the approximate maximum bandwidth required to transmit a CW signal? Actually, they've got 150 hertz. 150 hertz. So in this particular case, is the answer to this question. Then we get to a little bit easier stuff. This is some of the stuff you'd have to know if somebody gave you, or you need to know if somebody gave you a license and gave you some radio gear. What are the basic equipment and terms? Well, first of all, you have a transmitter. That's also XMET. By the way, the word X is often substituted for trans. So if you have X-mitter, well, that's transmitter. X-former is a transformer. So X is often used for trans in that way. Receiver recovers the information from the radio signal. Antenna converts the transmitted signals to RF energy to radiate and RF energy back to signals going to the receiver. So the antenna has a very big influence there. The feed line connects the antenna to the receiver and the transmitter. The TR switch, now this is something you don't usually see because most people now do use transceivers, and the transmit receive switch, which is what TR stands for, connects the antenna to the receiver or the transmitter, and it switches back and forth. If you were to transmit straight into this receiver, you'll pretty much roast the receiver because it can't handle that. Remember, the receiver is looking for really microscopic signals. Think about how much electricity is in this room right now. This antenna has to pick up. Now, in this room would be terrible because we're in the middle of a big, big building. So actually in the past, I won't try it right now, I've tried to talk to somebody or tried to get a signal in here, and you don't get much of a signal. But imagine even if I walk outside, how much signal is there floating around me? Well, this has to take signals that are floating around me and around you and around everybody and turn that into something that I can hear. So it's looking for very, very, very faint signals. On the other hand, when I'm transmitting, I'm trying to transmit a really powerful signal. Actually, the limitation on this is the battery. I don't want to go too, I'll pull down the transmit power on this, not because I don't want to transmit with more power, but mainly because I don't want to burn the battery out. I want the battery to last as long as possible. So in that case, I may try to pull it back. So, what was I here? Yeah. So you can't have them transmitting into each other. So you have to have the transmit receive switch. Now, in the old days, and actually with some equipment like Carl has, do you use a dial key? Is that what you have?
Some do. I have two of my transmitters have dial keys, and then I have manual knife switches.
Right, okay. Well, you have to have a switch to go from transmitter. Again, my first setup was a separate transmitter and receiver. Did not work together. They were just separate. And I had to have what's called a dial key switch to switch from transmit to receive. The transceiver combines a transmitter and receiver in a single package. That's what most people have now, and that's what's common. A repeater. We talked about repeater for much of the time here, and we just assume that a lot of people know what we're talking about. It's a station that transmits a received signal simultaneously on another frequency. Okay, it extends the range of portable equipment beyond line of sight. Again, with this handheld, and he showed you that on the video, if Carl were to go down the road and he had a handheld and I have a handheld, we might talk to each other for a mile or 2 miles or something. That would probably, if ideal circumstances, maybe 3 or 4 miles, 5 miles. But if I can just get to the top of the WRAL tower, if my signal can just make it to the top of the WRAL tower, which is about 2,000 feet, and his can just barely make it there, we can talk to each other, even though I may be 10 miles one side of the tower and he may be 10 miles the other side of the tower. So it extends the range of portable equipment immensely. That's why repeaters are so popular. What's tough here is the transmitter and receiver must operate simultaneously on different frequencies. And the magic that allows that to happen is called the duplexer. That keeps the transmitter signal from being put in directly into the receiver and blowing it up, like I was just telling you don't want to have happen. Now, the trick with duplexers, or they used to be, I used to be manage a repeater that's still still on the air, but somebody else owns it now. But a duplexer is a pretty big device, and it has to be tuned specifically so that the frequency this guy is putting out will be attenuated so that it doesn't burn out the receiver. And it was a pretty big mechanical type device, mechanically tuned device, should say that. It wasn't mechanical per se, but it was a mechanically tuned device that would prevent that from happening. Okay, power supplies. Typically now, a transceiver, or even receivers or whatever, most of them require 13.8 volts, or what we would generally call 12 volts, like a car battery or whatever, to run. So typically now, if you buy a transceiver, you must also have or buy a power supply that will convert 120 to 13.8 volts DC. By the way, for those of you that may not know, that's the typical operating voltage of your car when it's cranked, is about 13.8 volts. We think of a 12 volt battery, but the car's voltage system is really about 13.8. So a 100 watt transceiver, if it's transmitting, draws about 20 amps or more at 13.8 volts. So it requires a pretty big power supply. However, doesn't require as big a power supply today as it used to. And that is, there's what called switching supplies. Now, we can thank the computer industry for that. And they build higher capacity power supplies that are much lighter. Used to, they'd say about an amp a pound. So I have a 40 amp old style power supply at home, and it's not quite 40 pounds, but it's pretty hefty. It's pretty hefty. But I have a 25 amp switching power supply that I can just sit here and do exercises with. It's essentially very, very light. The thing you have to watch out with switching power supplies, and this is where EHAM, I don't have it written, but eham.net is a good place. Some of them cause noise. That's the downside of switching power supplies, is they can cause radio noise. But when I mentioned EHAM, they have a review section, and if a new power supply comes out, people will review, does it cause noise, and other aspects of it.
You're saying it gets interference when you're transmitting?
Yes,
receiving,
it can give you
like on your speaker system or something like that?
Yeah, when you're listening.
Yeah.
It can cause interference to you trying to listen, literally interference on your receiver. So, and some of them do create a hash. And obviously that's not good, and they get a bad reputation very quickly. But EHAM is a good place that has a review section. By the way, I have no connection to EHAM other than as a user. And I'm a subscriber too, because I use it enough, I try to help support it. But anyway, so that's what you have to check out. Again, you never get something for nothing. There's always trade-offs. So, okay, microphone, which if you're going to talk, you need a mic. But a microphone is something that you have to have with it. And also if you're going to send Morse code, this is a really, really fancy, and you can read that to say expensive, code key there. You can use headphones. If you have family members that aren't as enamored with the sounds of radio as you are, then headphones work out pretty well, or an external speaker. Most of the transceivers come with a speaker in them, but they're a little speaker, they're aimed straight up usually, and the fidelity is not very good. So if you want to listen to it, an external speaker. Amplifier, typical transceiver will put out about 100 watts. A few of them go to 200, some of them go a little over 100, but typically it's 100 watts. You're legally allowed to transmit with 1500 watts PEP, peak envelope power. We'll get into that a little bit, but later. So if you don't think 100 watts is enough, and in many cases, if you're working really far distance overseas stations, having extra power is nice, you can get an amplifier, power amplifier, that will increase the strength of your signal. Okay, what is a transceiver? Simultaneously transmits and receives other amateur signals. What kind of amateur station simultaneously transmits the signal of another amateur station on a different channel or channels? A repeater, that's right. This is one we get into some nitty gritty here. So we get into Ohm's law, and Ohm's law is one of the basic foundational formulas and laws that you need to know in electronics. And really, if you had a good physics class in high school, you learned Ohm's law then, but this is a repetition of that and getting into it a little more in depth. Okay, atoms are organized like our solar system. Electrons, which are negatively charged, orbit a nucleus, a positive nucleus. Okay, the electrical current in a wire is the movement of electrons. With enough force or pressure, the electrons can be made to move from atom to atom through a material, and that's how we get our electricity. Okay, important thing to remember, some people don't, the flow of electrons are like marbles if they're put in a pipe here. So with a little force here, we push a marble out down here. Now, the marble here doesn't travel the whole distance, which is to say the electricity coming out of this outlet up here is not an electron that was at Sharon Harris a tenth of a second ago. It's bumps one, bumps another, bumps another, bumps another, etc. And that's what essentially an electron at Sharon Harris gets excited, gets motivated, so to speak, and it bumps them all down the line, and then you come to the electrons that come out of our outlet. Actually, if electrons had to move that far, they wouldn't go at the speed of light, because technically we don't have warp drive like they did in Star Trek, so we are still limited by the speed of light. So if you have a pipe like this, though, there is friction in the pipe, so it takes a certain amount of force to begin to move it. So, but again, this ball goes in here, let's say this pipe is a mile long, and you push this ball in here, this ball drops out almost simultaneously, but it's not that a ball has moved the whole distance, it's simply that the energy has moved that distance. Okay, to conduct electricity, or to transmit electricity, we need conductors. They have low resistance. Most metals have low resistance. Copper, particularly so, aluminum, silver, gold. So copper, given a cost-benefit ratio, is about the best, so that's what you see most of the wires made out of. You see connectors made of silver and gold. In most cases, they're not worth the extra money to be in silver or gold, but they can be a prestige item, I guess. Insulators are just the opposite. They have very high resistance. Glass, ceramics, plastics tend to be insulators. Well, we're talking about conductors. Why do we need insulators? Well, because we've got all these conductors together, but if they're all together touching each other, they're going to conduct in areas and paths that we don't want them to conduct. So we put all the wires together, we got the conductors to keep the electrons within this circuit. We have insulation that keeps the electrons from interfering with each other. Okay, many people use the flow of water as a substitute or a way to discuss the flow of electricity. And in this particular case, you've got a pipe. One has low pressure, one has high pressure. The low pressure will give you a lower flow in gallons per minute. High pressure will give you a higher flow in gallons per minute. So again, a direct relationship between the pressures and the amount of flow coming out of them. Similarly, water pressure is like voltage and the flow is like the current. The voltage is the water pressure, and so a greater voltage produces a greater current flow. So that's what you have to know, or you need to know from that. That's the analogy with water. Then also though, just like with a small pipe and a large pipe, a small pipe is going to give you a low flow. In this particular case, think of a small pipe as having high resistance. A large pipe has lower resistance, and so it gives you a higher flow, less impeding the flow, or resisting the flow. So here, as we say here, pipe size is resistance, water pressure is voltage, flow is current. If you maintain the same voltage or water pressure, then a lower resistance pipe gives us greater flow. Okay, current flow increases with increasing voltage and decreases with decreasing voltage. So then what you got, we remember, if you will, I is intensity of current. So I is current, E is electromotive force, which is voltage, and R is resistance. And by doing your algebra, you can convert that several different ways. And the main thing to remember though is E equals I times R. Or as they used to, for air, if you spelled air with an E, that's That would be air, E equals I times R. This is what you need to really remember, is the circle of Ohm's law. If you haven't done any algebra in years, this will still bail you out. Essentially, you take that, you put your hand over what you need to find out, and that tells you, in this case, R equals E over I. I equals E over R. E equals I times R. And that gets you pretty much everything you need to do your calculations for Ohm's law. Now, we'll see this several times, and we can't emphasize this enough. You have to be in the basic units. You can't be milliamps and millivolts don't work. You've got to have everything in the same units, which is generally volts, amps, and ohms, not milliohms and mega amps or whatever. You've got to keep the units straight, and that's the real key to getting the questions right. They're not terribly complicated, but the real key is that we always use base units right there. So if you have to, you got to convert volts, amps, and ohms before the calculation. So that gets back to the milli, pico, nano, mega, etc. we went through at the very beginning. You need to have the ability to convert those back and forth, because here you want volts, here you want amps, and here you want ohms, not milliohms or whatever. So you want to keep those in base units. Okay, we'll do some crunching on that in just a little bit. Schematic symbols are standard shapes that represent the electrical components. They show how it's connected electrically. They don't show how it's laid out on a circuit board or how it's laid out on a chassis inside a radio. This just shows you the electrically which this particular battery is connected to a wire to this resistor, which is connected back to the battery. This wire could be 10 feet long, and this wire could be an inch long, but you don't get that from the schematic. So you have to, there's other things you have to know how what the physical layout looks like. But this gives you the electronics of the situation. Now, the circuit provides a complete path for current. So in this particular case, got a complete path. If you have an open circuit, that's a break in the path. You know what? Once in a while we want an open circuit. You know what we call that? A switch. A switch makes an open circuit. We'll get into that a little later, but a switch makes an open circuit. Then you get a short circuit. We almost never want a short circuit. But in this particular case, it's where the path for the current bypasses an intended element of the circuit, and it will cause, generally speaking, excess current. And that's what we have fuses for, is to help us during those situations. Okay, using Ohm's law with this particular circuit, we've got 14 volts and 7 amps, and will give us 8 ohms. 2 ohms. So if you know any of those two, you can get the other, if you remember the little circle there. So 14 volts up at top, and 7 and 2. So you can see 7 equals 14 divided by 2. In this case, 2 equals 14 divided by 7. 7 times 2 equals 14. So that shows you all the interactions of Ohm's law in one particular little circuit there. Okay, this is series circuit. It's where you have 2 resistors in series in a row. In this particular case, the current is the same through both resistors, but voltage divides across the resistors. So there's a voltage drop over each resistor, so the voltage here, here, and here is different. but the current's the same throughout the. All right, parallel circuit. In this particular case, the voltage is the same across each resistor, but the current divides through each resistor. And that shows a representation of it. Okay, this is something that's just, it's interesting to know. I don't think there's any questions on the test about this, but essentially in electronics, you think of the positive voltage being the higher potential with respect to negative, and so the current flows from the higher potential to the lower, from plus to minus. However, the current flow through a wire is a flow of electrons or negative charges, which actually flow in the opposite direction. So we consider the flow from positive to negative, but the electrons are actually flowing the opposite direction. So just an interesting point. Okay, meters. How do you know how many volts you've got or amps you've got or what's the resistance, etc.? Used to be called a VOM, volt ohm meter. Used to be something called a VTVM, a vacuum tube voltmeter, which was a little more accurate. Now we get multimeters. If you go to Harbor Freight, you can get one for about $3. I'm not sure how good it is, but you can get one anyway. They'll give you a number. And so you've got multimeters here that are all digital. This is what the old Simpson electronics. I took in high school, I was in what was called college prep, but I also took some vocational courses just to create my own kind of pre-engineering class. And we had the Simpson voltmeters, and they had the overload button on them. And it was very fortunate that they did, because the day the man handed them out to the class and said, hook them up, they hooked them up and you could hear pop, 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 because they were all hooked up wrong. And it would have roasted the meter if they hadn't had the overload, essentially, breaker in there. And so we had to go back and reset them all. And fortunately that saved, but the Simpson was considered one of the Cadillacs. Actually, talking about kits, I built a volt-ohm meter kit from Heathkit that looks very much like that, but it was a Heathkit one, and I did it to save money. I could get a kit cheaper than I could buy. Simpson, though, was considered like the Cadillac brand of VOM, analog VOMs. And there's still things, as it says, there's still things you can do with analog meters that works better than digital meters. If you've got something that's changing rapidly, the numbers on the LCD may wind up changing faster than you could even read them. So, but while watching the rising and falling of the needle, you might be able to tell a little more what's going on. So anyway, this is what multimeters typically look like. The digital meters are higher precision, but the thing is you got to do is you got to make sure that when you take a meter reading that you don't disturb the circuit that's being measured. Circuits are delicate things. Mike likes to say they're paranoid, so you got to sneak up on them before you can actually take a reading. So what you wind up doing is having meters that are set up in a way that minimize the errors and minimizes the insertion losses and insertion modifications that it makes to the circuit. So this particular case, but to measure current, you have to get in series with the current itself. So in this particular case, you have to break the circuit to measure it for current with an ammeter. Now a multimeter contains an ammeter, voltmeter, ohm meter, and usually a lot of other things as well. So we were saying right then, we're using an ammeter. Yeah, there we go, ammeter. But in reality, we're using a multimeter here, that one function of which can be an ammeter. The other thing you need to know is we've got this thing here that shows different range of resistance, different range of voltage, different ranges of amperes that it'll measure, and you've got to be sure that you've got it set properly before you could set it up. Because if it's set improperly, it could blow up, and the cheaper ones don't have the automatic reset like the Simpson did. So now what you've got now though is some that are auto ranging and auto detection. So you just hook them up. Essentially, it automatically ranges to whatever your thing is, and you punch amps. And actually, I think that's what this one is. So you just, it doesn't have a range thing. You just plug it in and essentially tell it what you want, and it'll spit it out for you. Okay, the meter shouldn't disturb the circuit being measured. In this particular case, you can measure the voltage drop across the resistor, but you got to make sure that the voltmeter and the leads are rated for the voltage to be measured. Okay, in this case, measuring ohms, you got to watch out if you set the meter for ohms while you're trying to measure voltage. That is, if you don't have one that's automatic ranging, you got to make sure that the circuit in this particular case is not energized so you can measure the resistance across it. So there's a lot of things you have to remember to protect your equipment, and some things you need to know to protect yourself. I, as a part of my work in energy, have put on a lot of meters and whatnot. Fortunately, I don't have to do much of that now. But that's a picture of me set up for what's called arc flash. You have to be very careful if you're dealing, this is set up to take voltage readings up to about 600 volts. And you can get all kinds of problems with that that can hurt you really, really bad, what could kill you, or even cause you to have your hand amputated, etc. So I've got special gloves on, under the electrician's type gloves. I've got fire resistant suit there, obviously a headpiece on, and that was in February in Pittsburgh. So that was not so bad. I had to wear that same getup in July in Georgia. Then it was a problem. It was a real problem, and I'm really happy that I don't have to do that, at least not recently, in a while anyway. But that's what an arc flash getup looks like. So this is what you need to remember. So you want to be careful with electricity. Electricity is a very subtle kind of thing. You look at a bus bar that's got 480 volts, and it looks like that piece of metal. It's not making any noise. It's not. There's nothing about it that you look at that you can tell that it's deadly, but it is deadly. If you touch it, you're pretty much dead. So, and you shouldn't be any around it unless you're wearing the suit that I'm wearing. Now, to be honest, I'm old enough. The safety training I first got on working on electricity is they said, Curt, go do this and don't get hurt. That was my safety training. So fortunately, I knew enough from the electronics that I had to be appropriately cautious in taking the measurements and whatnot. But we want you to be hands for a long, long time, so be sure to, we'll get into safety a little later, but be sure to keep safety in mind, whatever you're doing with your ham radio. Energy and power. Well, you gotta have some way to store, you need to have some way to store energy. A fuel tank works for gasoline, propane, fuel oil, that kind of thing. A battery essentially is an electrical fuel tank. So the energy is how much is in the tank, and the power is how fast you can get the power out of the tank, or how fast the tank will empty. And then the other part of Ohm's law, besides the power equation, is essentially it's pi. You should remember that. E equals IE. And so between the two of those, you can figure out almost whatever you need to in terms of what are the parameters of a circuit. So, okay, we've got a 60 watt bulb operating on 120 volts. What is the current through the bulb? 60 watts, 120 volts. I equal P over E, 60 watt, 20 volts, half an amp. Watt is the unit of electrical current. Ampere, that's right. What do we call the flow of electrons in a circuit? Current, that's right. What is another term for electromotive force, EMF? Voltage, that's right. What is the basic unit of EMF? Volts, right. What instrument would you use to measure electric EMF? A voltmeter. What is the correct way to connect a voltmeter? Parallel. Voltmeters in parallel. What's the correct way to connect an ammeter? That's in series, yes. What instrument would you use to measure current? Ammeter, that's right. What measurement do you use to measure resistance? Ohmmeter, that's right. How might you damage a multimeter?
I mean, an ohmmeter when you measure.
That's right, try to measure voltage when it's set to resistance, yeah. What kind of measurements are commonly made with a multimeter? Yeah, voltage and resistance. What precautions should you take before measuring resistance in a circuit?
Make sure it's not energized.
That's right, make sure the circuit's not energized. Remember, even if you turn it off, it may be energized, so you gotta be careful about that. Don't assume that just turning it off is gonna be all you need. What precautions should you take before measuring a high voltage? You want to make sure that the leads and the voltmeter are rated for the voltage you're going to measure. You want to make sure that your leads and the meter are rated for the voltage that you're going to be measuring. What's the example of a good electrical conductor? Copper, that's a good choice. What's the example of a good electrical insulator? They're asking, looking for glass. What is the unit of power? Watts, that's right. Current that flows in only one direction is called what? Direct current, not directional, but direct current. Current that periodically changes direction is called what? Alternating current. The rate at which electrical electricity is used is called what?
Power.
Power, that's right. What is the formula for electrical power? Pi, that's right. P equals I times E. Actually, in this case, I think they give us P equal E times I, but anyway. What is the power when the voltage is 12 volts and the current is 3.5 amps? That's right, 42 watts. That's right. What is the current in a 300 watt load with 50 volts applied? 6 amps. Everybody got that? Understand that? What is the resistance of a circuit that draws 4 amps from a 12 volt source? That's right, 3 ohms. What is the current flowing across a 24 ohm resistor connected across 240 volts? Okay, 10, that's right, 10 amps. Okay, resistors and resistance. Resistors oppose the flow of current. Where does some of the current go? It's dissipated as heat. Like resistors, if they're using a circuit, you touch one many times, it will be hot. Values can range from fractions of an ohm to several mega ohms. Physically larger resistors dissipate more power than small ones. That just makes sense, but it's true. If you try to dissipate enough power through a small resistor, it will burst or it will break. I've had them do that. So the schematic symbol for resistor is just a little squiggled line, and a variable resistor uses either, this is more typically what I tend to see, But sometimes whenever you have a volume control or whatever, they use that for a variable resistor, which by the way, a variable resistor is what you use in many cases for volume control. There are situations where you don't. As we mentioned again, energy is dissipated by heat or as heat. It opposes the flow of current. This is some more, again, we talked about fixed value, variable resistor. This is 3-terminal variable. Here's what potentiometers and volume controls look like. Here's a variable volume. That's actually how it works. You've got a contact that moves its way across the resistance wire, and depending on how much resistance wire is there, that varies the resistance. These are also some variable resistors. These are, you put a little, you don't generally put, well actually you can for this, but not in an inductor. You'll note that in most electronics boxes, you'll see what looks like a little flathead screwdriver, but it's made out of plastic or fiberglass. That's because you don't, first of all, even with these, it's better just not to be plunging around in there with a piece of metal. But secondly, if you're adjusting a variable inductor, it changes the piece of metal, actually changes the inductance as you're doing it. So you have to have something that's non-conductive for that. But even in these situations, it's better to have a non-conductive device to make the adjustment, just from a safety standpoint. Okay, capacitors. Capacitors are a pair of metal plates separated by an insulator. The insulator in a capacitor is called the dielectric. It stores energy in a field between the plates, and it returns the energy to the circuit at a later time. For a reason we'll get to in just a little bit, it blocks DC current, but allows AC to flow. The symbol is C for capacitor. The unit of capacitance is farad, F-A-R-A-D, and the common prefixes are microfarad, picofarad, you can see that one, nanofarad, and sometimes just farad. So in one sense, it's like an instantaneous battery. It stores a charge for a while, but it releases it all at once. Well, that's good sometimes, it's not so good. It's not really good as a battery per se, but there's certain times you can use one in a sort of battery type situation. You measure, in this particular say, resistance with capacitor in a circuit. That shows what happens, what will happen here is the charge in the capacitor will go through the resistor, and then you get the capacitance there, and then it totally dissipates. There's no longer any power there. So it looks like a low value resistor that with a value that begins to increase with time. And then because whenever it's discharged, it's like an open circuit. It's literally like an open circuit. But as long as it has a charge for just a second, it acts as if it's, like say, literally like a battery until it dissipates the charge. This is one thing variable capacitors look like. They call these bread slicers because it looks like something that would slice bread. This is a cross-section, what a cross-section of an air variable capacitor looks like. This is what's called a compression trimmer. In this particular case, you change the distance between the fixed plate and the movable plate. The screw actually makes the distance change, and so that's what they call a compression trimmer. Here's some other pictures. You will notice, if you look at it, that a capacitor on a surface mount circuit board looks almost like a resistor. That's part of the problem too. One looks like the other, looks like the other. You got to really be careful with what you're doing. In this particular case, by the way, in many cases you'll see this. You see the C9 there. That's telling you that's capacitor C9, and there should be a schematic that will tell you what the value of C9 should be. Same thing with C31 and C34. But these are ceramic capacitors. This is what an internal construction of a ceramic capacitor looks like. These are what's called electrolytic capacitors. These are the kind of capacitors that burst over time and essentially will wind up putting like a goo on the circuit board. Because they have, the dielectric in there is almost like a paste. This is a tantalum capacitor here on the circuit board. And then this is where they call them bread slicers. That's what some of them look like also. Inductors, okay? It stores energy in a magnetic field. Okay, we know the capacitor stores energy in an electric field. It stores it in a magnetic field. The symbol for an inductor is L. The unit is Henry, and it can be picohenries, nanohenries, microhenries, etc. Sometimes just a Henry is the inductor. This is what some of them look like. This is an air wound inductor. This is a metal core conductor. This is what some of them look like. These are variable inductors that you can see. They can be tapped or they can be continuously variable. So they have different ways of handling that. Here's more pictures of different types of inductors. You can see how small these are, pretty small, but generally, even with these guys, you've got to have a certain amount of real estate for an inductor because of the way it works. You can miniaturize them, obviously, but there's a kind of limit as to exactly how small you can make them, given what you're looking for in terms of inductance. Transformers are two inductors that share a common magnetic field. So as you can see here, you've got an inductor on one side, you've got a magnet metal piece in between the two, and then you've got inductor on the other side. A transformer can step down 120 volts down to a lower voltage for use of electronic equipment. That's one of the things that are typically happening in the wall wards. The little things that you plug in is that it's stepping down the voltage. Usually it's also converting the AC to DC, so you've got a rectifier in there. But in this particular case, 100 turns on one side where you have 50 volts and 50 turns on the other side. It's a direct ratio, so your 50 volts with half the number of turns becomes 25 volts. Now you can also go the other way. You can have 25 volts and you can make it 50 volts. You don't get something for nothing though. Remember our conversions here. If you double the voltage capability, you have the current capability. Because you don't get something for nothing. We can't come up with a miraculous new machine that we start with 20 volts here and we can power the whole city of Raleigh with. So you make conversions, but you have to make them within the realm of reality. So that's what you wind up using most of the transformers for. Is you've got big guys. This is where transmission voltages are up in the thousands of volts. Well, you don't need, and really industry generally doesn't need thousands of volts in their plants. So these big transformers, the thousands of volts is transmitted from Sharon Harris to Greensboro or Sharon Harris to Charlotte or whatever. But then when it gets within Charlotte, it has to be use transformers to bring the voltage down to the voltages they need for distribution and then for actual use within the facilities in the town. This is more what you generally see what a transformer looks like. These are some other pictures of them also though. The ability to store energy in an electric field is called what?
Capacitance.
Capacitance, that's right. What is the basic unit of capacitance? Farad, that's right. What is the ability to store energy in a magnetic field called? Inductance, that's right. What is the basic unit of inductance?
Henry.
The Henry, that's right. What electrical component is used to oppose the flow of current in a DC circuit? See, this is a resistor in this particular case, a resistor. What type of component is often used as an adjustable volume control?
Potentiometer.
Yeah, potentiometer, that's right. What electrical parameter is controlled by a potentiometer? resistance. Again, you're not going to get two of these questions in a row. What electrical component stores energy in an electric field? A capacitor, that's right. Okay, what type of electrical component consists of two or more conductive surfaces separated by an insulator? Capacitor. What type of electrical component stores energy in a magnetic field? Inductor, that's right. What kind of electrical component is usually composed of a coil of wire? Inductor. And what component is commonly used to change 120 volt AC house current to lower voltage for other uses? A transformer, that's right.